ask you a question. Are you doing what you want to be doing in your life right now? Do you feel like you need a reset or are in the middle of one that perhaps you didn't choose for yourself? That's what this segment is about, the reset. We're bringing you candid conversations with people brave enough to have them. And this week, I'm sitting down with Dr. Lori Stevic-Rust. She's a clinical health psychologist who admits in one pivotal moment, fear almost detoured her whole career. What she says about how to find your strength and reset your purpose.
This was one of those moments where I could step back and stand in this moment and go, that changed me forever. Yeah.
So what was it?
Yeah, so August 15th, 1988, first day of my internship at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. I was I was the youngest in my class, so I think I was probably only like 23, 24 maybe. And I say that because looking back, it was like, oh my gosh, I was so young. I woke up that morning to get ready and I could hear all these voices in my head. The voices of all my professors during my clinical experiences saying how women are supposed to be psychologists. You know, I look back now.
So in their mind, there was a blueprint specifically for women.
Yes. You know, it was important that I wear sensible shoes, not flats, not spiky heels, but sensible shoes, sensible colors. Psychologists, particularly women, I don't know if the men ever got these kind of messages, but, you know, crying as a psychologist was really frowned upon, you know, because that's not what psychologists do. There was an expectation, I think, of how women, particularly entering this field, were supposed to behave. Now, again, remember, we're talking about 1988, so.
Which really sadly doesn't seem that long ago.
No, right, yeah, but true, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I remember waking up, putting on a olive-colored bland dress, short gray pumps, and my white lab coat. And over the lapel it said Dr. Lori Stevic-Rust, and I panicked. And I thought, oh my gosh, like this is serious, like and real. Like I felt this total disconnect between I'm supposed to be this person that's in this mirror with this lab coat and professional and entering this hospital, and inside I felt like the little kid and I just wanted to go home and sit at my grandmother's table and have hot chocolate. And so so that's how my day started. I got to the floor where I was going to be seeing my first patient, and it was in an intensive care unit, and my professor my supervisor was probably, you know, I don't know age now when you look back, he seemed stately to me, you know, with the glasses kind of over the bridge of his nose and the gray hair and serious looking. And as I was walking towards him in the center of the intensive care unit at the nurse's station, I could feel my heart racing, thinking, okay, like, I felt like I was walking in my mother's big girl shoes, which is really where the title of my book came from, and I was falling out of them. Like I was having this out of body, like, oh my gosh, like, this is like what grown-up people do, and I'm not here. So we get to the room.
We've all felt like that before.
Have you? Okay, good.
Good.
Do you still kind of
grown up, but I don't feel like a grown up right now.
I'm so glad you said that, because here at 60, I'm really still not sure that I've entered completely into that grown-up phase.
I'm with you, girl. I am with you 100%, and most people who really know me will agree with that.
We'll agree that, well, maybe we don't need to be grown up. Maybe those shoes don't have to fit quite that way.
Yeah, I like that thinking. But they did for you in this moment. So.
They were falling off me. And so I already had, the reason I preface what's about to happen is I was already feeling insecure. I was already feeling like an imposter. Like I got the coat on, I got the doctor title, and nothing on the outside is mirroring this insecure little girl on the inside. And then the story gets worse. So my first patient is room 3, and they referred to it as room 3. We're going to room 3. So I reviewed the chart, and the question that was being asked of me, as the psychologist, was, is this person competent to make a decision to end treatment, which will ultimately end his life? Not bad for the first day, my first case, right?
Talk about true life or death.
Oh yeah. And making sure that he had cognitive capacity to do that. And that's, part of what health psychologists do in hospital settings. So I get to room 3, and it's got the precaution sign on the outside. So anybody who works in healthcare, you know the precaution sign is, you're dressing in full coverage, mask, goggles, shoe covers, because this person has a illness or disease that is infectious, and it's to protect the healthcare provider. So universal precautions were in place for this person. I knew from reading the chart that this was somebody who had AIDS. What I didn't appreciate in my young naivete is it was 1988, and when we went into the room, this was a very young man, like my age. And he was gay. And so, of course, at the time, if somebody who was gay had AIDS, you could feel the writing them off on the floor. And you didn't need to be an experienced clinician to know that he was gay, so he pretty much did this to himself, and we got other patients to take care of. Was some of the whisperings that you could hear, but also the feeling. So now I enter the room, and what I saw was a young man with his eyes so crystal blue, but sunken deep inside of his head. His arms had lesions, which is very consistent with advanced stages of AIDS. And as I got closer, he slipped his arms underneath the covers and said, "Don't come any closer." I could feel the level of shame in that room. His, mine, my shame was, I am ill-equipped to do what is being asked of me here. His shame, of course, was my perception of what was happening. He caught me glance past him to his nightstand, and on his nightstand was just a plain wooden frame of 2 smiling men, young men, on a bicycle, and the sun was shining. And the room had nothing else. There were no get well cards, there were no balloons, there was nothing in that room. And as he caught me glance past it, he said to me, "Yes, that used to be me." So now I'm feeling like the weight of and the magnitude of what's in that room. And I thought, and my supervisor's staring at me from across, and I have my little clipboard, and I started to cry. And the voices in my head of, again, psychologists and women don't cry. Women are supposed to be sensitive, but if you're a professional woman, you can't show that. You need to be nurturing and kind and compassionate, but stoic and stern when you're doing the job. I mean, any woman who's watching this knows the duality of our messages. Yeah. We should be this and this. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know what to do. And so as I started to cry, I could see my supervisor kind of roll his eyes. And I thought, this is not a profession for me. I can't help this young man. I'm not equipped or prepared. I left the room and I started to cry in the hallway.
So wait a minute, this is after how many years of school?
So it was my first internship, but I had already done practicums. So I was probably in year 8.
So you're in year 8 and you have a moment where you say, this is not for me.
Yeah. So
That's
undergraduate,
huge.
4 years, and then 4 years of graduate work, and this was my internship as part of those last 4 years.
Had you ever in those 8 years questioned?
No.
So this was the moment.
This was it.
So what happened when you went to the hallway?
So I started to cry in the hallway, and I thought, I've made a huge mistake. Like, this is not the profession for me. This internship is too big for me, because my professor, who was supposed to be my advocate, when I applied to Henry Ford, said, you won't get in. They don't take people from our program. They don't take inexperienced people. They want people who've been in the workforce before. So in my head, I could hear, okay, you applied, and just because you got in doesn't mean you're worthy of being here. So all of these voices are floating in my head, and I thought I have a choice to make. I can leave the profession, I can leave the floor, and then make a decision about what to do with the rest of my life. Or I can go back in there. And I can go back in there as Lori, not as this person that I'm expected to be. And I took a deep breath, and I went back in that room. And I pulled up a chair, and I sat next to his bed. His name was Nelson. Nobody called him Nelson. They called him Room 3. And for an hour, I listened to Nelson's stories about his life and about how his family had disowned him because he was gay, how there was nobody in the waiting room, how life didn't have any more meaning for him, how he wanted to die and wanted the permission to do that. And that conversation, I realized that I could be, and this was the reset of how I viewed myself as a psychologist. In that moment, I realized what he needed wasn't that PhD or somebody with a lot of experience. He needed somebody who authentically would show up and be present with him. And that's what I was able to give him. And it changed me because from that moment on, I thought, I will never be what other voices are telling me to be. I will be smart and wear high heels. I will cry and be smart. I will be all of these things and exactly who I am. And at that moment, the total reset of what I thought a female psychologist was supposed to be changed. And the power of being authentic to who we are, the uniqueness of who we are, and particularly for women, we don't get that message. We don't understand the power of and. I can be smart and soft. I can be funny and serious. You know, that powerful and, instead of this duality that women are put into, because if you're a crier and you're nurturing, you're not going to be the leader in this organization because that means you're too soft. We need the tough person, which is usually the man, right? So in that moment, and I think was a major reset for me, and it's a gift that I think about, that the gift that Nelson gave me.
Did he die after that?
Yes, yes. The decision was that he had the capacity to end his own treatment, and he died the next day.
I love the whole concept of remember your and, because all
It's
I can
powerful.
think of with you is, yes, you were fearful and you were brave, because you didn't do what everybody told you had to do. So how did they react?
The supervisor was in the room, and what I recall of that moment was when I first went in, with my little clipboard, he was standing in the corner observing me, because again, it was my first case. But when I went back and I sat at the bed, my supervisor left and went back to the nursing station to give me, I think, that time, and then it was for us to process later. And to be honest, I don't really remember the debriefing or the processing or anything that was being said from my supervisor. And I don't know if it was because it wasn't really talked about or it didn't matter. But over the years, like, that part of the story isn't present for me. I just remember that from that moment on, anytime I had to choose to do something that was more what Lori would do, and the way that with my strengths and my weaknesses and my flaws and my gifts all wrapped into one, I'm going to show up in a room with all of that. And sometimes it's not always easy, but every time I do it, I think, this is what we're here for. I'm not you and you're not me, and we have to be able to show up in a room with all of what's unique to us, especially, I think, in professions that are helping professions. It's so easy, and the danger, I think, of being in the trenches with people's pain and their sadness and their sorrow is always the risk of then putting up a wall and not feeling it, because you have to preserve yourself. I always wanted to be the person who could feel it, who could pull back and know when I needed to do some good self-care, but never somebody who would become so numb to what I was hearing or seeing, because I thought the day that happens is the day that I stop being a psychologist.
So I don't want to give a false sense of what happened here. You were fearful, you went in, you were you made this decision. My assumption is, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not as though you were never fearful again those moments.
Oh, no. Fearful all the time. I mean, I think there are so many things, particularly in this profession, of, did you do the right thing? Did you say the right thing? Your words are heavy, and I recognize the gift and the beauty of the profession and the work that I do. When you're helping somebody, when you're navigating things with somebody, when you're on their path and their journey with them, there's tremendous responsibility with that. And sometimes that means stepping in and acknowledging my fear and figuring out how to incorporate that fear with my strength. But I think when we try to say we have to put ourselves into these buckets instead of the nuanced, messy middle, which is really what life is, and that's where our power sits. That's where we have the real capacity to make change. And once we realize that in our life, we can never go back.
But you can still move forward, but you can still be fearful.
Oh, yeah.
In that, and we all know that.
Oh,
because
yeah.
It's almost as though we say, it's the same thing we talked about earlier. Why am I not over this yet? Why am I not over this fear yet?
Yeah, I think when we wait for fear to pass, life is going to pass because we're supposed to be fearful. Things that are unknown, things that are challenging, things that carry a big, heavy risk with them and responsibility should make us fearful. But it's what we do with that that matters.
So in this world of comparison and people not feeling like they can be authentic because then maybe they won't fit into whatever they're trying to fit into, how do you get to that place of authenticity where you know, oh, this is who I am, and be okay with it? And I'm assuming it's like we're talking, it's not one moment.
No.
This is a very gradual growth, season of growth. But how do we start that? Is it in that moment when we feel that discomfort?
Yeah, so I think when we think about who makes the best leaders, who do we want to work for, who are the friends that we really want to be around, who makes us feel safe and good? It's the people who really show up with their flaws and their strengths fully exposed. They are authentic, right? And so, when you think about yourself, it's like if you really want to be able to show up and be that leader, be that friend, you're not going to be perfect. Nobody wants perfect. Nobody wants perfect.
Perfect does not exist.
And because if somebody is faking their way to be perfect, there's nothing for you to connect to. If you are perfect, and you're pretty close.
Good. I'll slip for that 20 later for saying that one. But it couldn't be farther from the truth.
I can't connect with you because I'm not perfect. And so people want to be around people when they say, oh, they're so down to earth. What do we mean by down to earth? We mean they're real. They're just human. Just like the rest of us, they're human. We want to connect our humanness to one another. And you can't do that when you're faking it.
So how do you convey that to somebody who has built that wall because they've been so hurt? Vulnerability is devastatingly frightening to them. Because what you're saying is we need to learn to be vulnerable in who we are.
Yeah.
And that's a really scary place for some people to go.
Yeah, and I think, when we think about vulnerability, it's not about letting our guards down and giving everybody our whole life story because not everybody has earned the right to know our whole life story. So there's going to be places in our world where you don't want to be vulnerable. You want to keep the guard up a bit. You want to make sure that before I know you and you've earned the right to know my story or to be that close to what I need to share with you, that's going to come with time and experience. But I think for people who are watching who say, it's so scary, I don't want anybody to really know anything about me because I'm flawed or because I don't want to be judged or because I don't want to be bullied, all those voices, particularly for women, that goes through our head. The argument is, but if you don't risk intimate, close relationships, you'll be isolated and lonely, even in a room full of people. So find your people. Start off small. Find those people that who are vulnerable with you, that you can be vulnerable in kind. That you are practicing in safe, small circles, recognizing that you ultimately want to be able to expand those circles. And being vulnerable is the first courageous step. And it takes courage to do that. And recognizing that what's going to happen is you're going to weed out the people who don't belong in your life, who are not worthy. Because if you show your vulnerability and somebody abuses it, takes advantage of it, in so many ways, then it tells you this is not where your energy should be. And as women, what we end up doing is, but I want you to like me, so I'm going to work harder. So I'm going to keep, I want to be seen as important and capable and competent, and I want you to like who I am. So we keep pushing those bad relationships as opposed to saying, I wish you well. You're just not my people. Yeah.
Boundaries are, and I learned it so late in life, the importance and how imperative boundaries are, not just for myself, but for my relationships. Because if you don't set it, somebody is going to go over it. And if you don't either call it out or put that, pull away a little bit,
right,
you're just going to keep getting hurt.
Well,
and you have a right, not just a right, but you have a responsibility to yourself
Yes.
and to who you authentically are to set a boundary.
Yes. And I think what happens, and I keep going to women because I think women have a harder time with this, we think of boundaries as either being rigid, and then I'm kind of isolated, or if I put them up, then I'm going to look like I'm not caring and compassionate, and I say no, and I don't. And it comes from all of the years and years and years of messaging that women have received. Even from our original stories, whether it's stories in fairy tales or biblical or ancient Greek stories, it's all about not allowing women to really feel valued and worthwhile. And we've bought those stories and they sit deep in our bones, and it's time for us to be able to say, my boundary says I'm containing all of my worth here, and I'm not going to give it away. I'm not going to just allow you to come in and it's going to be all about you and nothing about me, and it's not reciprocal. But it's a journey, and it's a lifelong journey, I think. It's not a one and done, like here's your 5 steps to helping you build up your boundaries and keep your authenticity in check and your self-worth. But I think we have to start out small and start off in places where we feel safe.
And listen to our gut, because I think that's one of the things that we forget. If we don't trust ourselves, we don't necessarily trust our gut, but I think our gut will tell us, even if we aren't unsure of it, because how many of us are guilty of something being said and you thinking, oh, I don't want to hurt that person, so I'm not going to say anything. Or I'm sure that's not what they meant. Or, without recognizing that maybe something's there that I just need to be aware of. And that doesn't mean you set the boundary all the way to the ceiling.
Right.
Maybe that boundary grows based on the behavior you see.
It grows, and it's also tied to how we communicate. See, I think sometimes we are quick to make an assumption that I know what you mean by that, as opposed to allowing ourselves to be curious, like, okay, help me understand, what did you mean when you said?
I love the follow-up question because then I am having a conversation with you so I can understand, as opposed to how I will react.
Yes. And when we do that, it stops our primitive brain that goes into that whole hijack mode of be safe, shut down, that fight, flight, or freeze mode of, I'm going to shut down this conversation because you're starting to threaten me, or I'm leaving, or I'm going to tell you what I think of you. When we pause long enough to go, I just want to make sure I understood what you meant when you said. Now we're pausing and giving our brain a little bit of time to catch up. It's giving you time to clarify, and then my higher level functioning brain can go, yeah, that doesn't work for me. Whatever she's saying is not fitting, or I made an assumption that they meant something in a hurtful way and they didn't.
Yeah.
But it's really important, I think, that we stop with the assumptions, because we think we tell ourselves the whole story. Like, I'm going to tell myself a whole story of what I'm going to say, what you're going to say, what the conclusion's going to be, and then we walk away. And we never pause long enough to really engage with each other. And that's where our curiosity about it. I'm just curious about that. I'm not sure I understood it.
That's kind of your hallway moment.
Yes.
Right? You walked out of the room into the hallway, and you had a moment. And you knew where your boundary was, and you knew where you had to tear the boundary down.
And trust that gut feeling. It didn't feel right. Yeah.